Hello and welcome to this video where we update you on the Russia-Ukraine front over the past 3 months. This period has been marked by a clear slowdown in Russian advances and even a retreat in the southern area. But above all, we have seen confirmation of Ukrainian dominance in the field of drones, both at short range with more and more FPV kamikaze drones, which now cause more than 80% of casualties for the Russians, as well as at medium range, which is having an increasingly significant effect on Russian logistics, which is being hit almost everywhere, especially in the south. But also with this new superiority in the field of long-range drones, which is making it increasingly difficult for Russia to finance its war effort. With dozens of ammunition depots, factories, logistics centers, and refineries being destroyed, this is now causing fuel shortages in more than half of the Russian regions. So if we start with an analysis of the territorial changes of the control of the ground by Russia and by Ukraine, overall, the Russian advance has been almost completely stopped. Or more precisely, the advance along the Donbas is very slow, while Ukraine has been regaining ground, especially in the south of the country, since February. And actually, it is becoming increasingly difficult to measure territorial control by both sides. For example, if Russians must leave Crimea due to heavy bombardment, they're within Ukrainian artillery range and unable to defend themselves. Is it considered a liberated area as soon as the Ukrainians manage to plant a flag there, or is it an area that has become a gray zone? In the same way, when the Ukrainians manage to retake trenches to regain ground and to control it with robots, does a robot count as controlling the area, or does there really have to be humans in that zone? So that means the gray zone isn't calculated in the same way, depending on the analysts. But overall, those like ISW who count ground held by robots as controlled territory consider that Russia has retreated by 400 square kilometers between April and May. Some say Russia is breaking records for slowness, not advancing this slowly since summer 2023. So in any case, we can at least consider that Russia is stuck on the front, that it's advancing so slowly that it's almost imperceptible on the front, or even that it's retreating. If we consider that some areas that were occupied have become gray zones again, even though, of course, there are still areas where they are making progress, especially along the axis around Konstantinivka, in the Donbas. We'll get to that in a moment. If we look now at casualties, well, the rate of Russian losses remains very high, around 1,000 losses per day, which is problematic because it now exceeds the number of new recruits who agree to join the army. Ukraine shares thousands of videos each week like this, proving that many Russians are killed by FPV kamikaze drones. And in the end, we can prove the death of more than 230,000 Russian soldiers whose names we know individually. You can see here some war memorials that are appearing all over Russia, knowing that there is a delay of almost a year between the death and the confirmation of the names. And so the most reliable estimates now say that Russia has surpassed 500,000 dead and missing. This figure has been confirmed by British intelligence chiefs, knowing that the Russian Notarial Register of Successions had already recorded an excess mortality of more than 350,000 people by the end of 2025. Let's return to analyzing the situation in Ukraine. So overall, including the wounded, the dead, the missing, and the prisoners, Russia has losses ranging between 1.3 and 1.5 million men. And the worst part is that the rate of losses doesn't seem to be decreasing, since the Russian methods remain exactly the same, while Ukrainian drones are becoming more and more numerous in an attempt to stop infiltration attempts. Here is just one example of the many failed assaults we see daily along the front, with Russians running across fields and being picked off by drones. To these incredible numbers, we also have to add the tens of thousands of foreigners who have been killed, like the 2,300 North Korean soldiers who died in Ukraine, as is now confirmed by the new war memorial that was inaugurated by Kim Jong-un. And according to Andrew Perpetua and his team, who analyze more than 300 videos shared by both sides every day, the rate of Russian losses is not decreasing, because the Russians continue to use the same method, even though its effectiveness is very low compared to the human cost required for each of these operations. On the Ukrainian side, the dead and missing now number more than 205,000 according to UA losses, which records the dead, missing, and prisoners, thanks to a network of investigators who visit cemeteries. For example, in all Ukrainian cities, you have this type of memorial that is set up directly in front of the city hall. So you know who died in the city, and all the reporters can come and see. The OSINTers can do analyses, and we know exactly what is happening, unfortunately, in the country. So the Ukrainian figures, that's why they are very reliable, because there is direct transparency in the cities, but also with the lists of people who are awarded medals, which are directly available through government lists. And so, including the wounded, Ukrainian losses would be more than 500,000 men. This is a figure that is confirmed by Dutch intelligence services, and so overall the rate of Russian losses is still 2.5 times higher than that of Ukraine. This is normal for a country that is launching attacks, especially compared to a country that is mostly on the defensive. The one who sticks his head out of the trench, who puts himself in danger, and the one who picks them off with kamikaze drones. Obviously, the latter suffers fewer losses. If we now look at the material losses on both sides, the statistics show a continuous surge in the number of pieces of equipment destroyed, but actually this number is misleading, or rather we need to distinguish between military equipment and civilian equipment. Overall, the Russians have stopped sending armored columns to carry out assaults every day, since this method wasn't working and they have virtually exhausted their stock, which didn't allow them to sustain that level of losses. So for example, in this video, they are going to send 28 motorcycles for only 3 infantry fighting vehicles and no tanks. And that's why in the statistics, we see today 4 times fewer Russian material losses than what we could observe a year ago, and what you see here are the statistics taken from the War Spotting website. So this decrease in material losses isn't simply because the Russians have become better or more effective. It's simply that they place no value on the lives of their men, and they no longer have equipment, so they send them into combat despite the lack of suitable equipment. The second observation we can make here is the variety of equipment that is being destroyed. Last year, you can see the different colors. At that time, over 300 tanks and infantry fighting vehicles were destroyed. In contrast, in the last 3 months of 2026, that number has dropped to a third, and there are now almost only military transport vehicles left, which now alone account for half of the losses. So overall, since 2022, Russia has lost more than 24,000 pieces of military equipment, just based on what can be documented from open sources. And here, for example, these are images shared by the Russians themselves of their own convoys, destroyed armored vehicles that are passing by as they are heading to the front line. But now the rate of losses on the Russian side is only a few units per month. On the other hand, there is one area where losses are increasing, and that's in Russian logistics. For example, here you have the statistics for the destruction of logistics vehicles and fuel trucks, with now 2,500 destroyed each week and an almost exponential curve. I'll explain that to you in just a moment because it's a real strategic objective on Ukraine's part. And on Ukraine's side, their material losses are actually the opposite. Since they've been on the defensive for almost 3 years, well, they haven't really changed their methods and their losses remain stable at around 7 pieces of military equipment lost per day. These losses are mostly offset by new equipment from allies and increased local production, now at an all-time high. And so, statistically, the ratio is becoming unfavorable. And for the first time, we're starting to see more Ukrainian equipment destroyed than Russian equipment. But it's a misleading statistic, and Russian propaganda is using it to pretend that they're dominating and that the Ukrainians are losing more equipment. No, it's just that the Russians are losing lives instead of equipment, simply because they have more of it today. Now, if we take a look around the front, starting with the southern area, there are 2 factors that are going to be really important. First, the Ukrainian effort in destroying Russian air defenses is paying off, with an increase in the destruction of systems, Panzer units, S-300, S-400, and Buk systems, all along the front. There are really a lot of them, and many are even geolocated, as you can see on this map. As these systems are increasingly destroyed at the front, Russia is also withdrawing them to protect its cities from more frequent attacks. So the situation on the front is becoming more and more permissive, more and more open for drones, cruise missiles, helicopters, and even for Ukrainian fighter jets, which can get closer and closer to the Russian lines to bomb them. And so we have a lot of long-range Ukrainian drones that are helped by Starlink and by ways to bypass Russian electronic warfare, resulting in this strike capability with video feed that is becoming more and more common all along the front. For example, here we are in the city of Mariupol, which is 160 kilometers from the front, and you can see the quality of the video feed as well as the state of the city, by the way. And the Ukrainians are able to patrol the entire southern front in this way, with a clear objective, which is to cut off logistics to the occupied areas of Zaporizhzhia, Kherson, and the Dnipro Oblast. But also the goal is to completely isolate Crimea. And in this area, let's say it's relatively simpler since the entire Russian front basically relies on just one major highway and a railway line, and so on this railway, well, the locomotives and trains are regularly attacked, and on the highway there are so many attacks that it is now nicknamed by the Russians as the Highway of Death, and the Ukrainians share more than 40 pieces of evidence of truck destruction every day, with more than 800 successful strikes on Russian logistics in the area over the past 2 months, to the point that drivers no longer want to take these routes, which has caused a 70% decrease in truck traffic on this road. And you can even notice that even when the Ukrainians use simple FPV kamikaze drones, Well, the video feed is absolutely perfect for the Ukrainian pilots, even on vehicles that are equipped with jammers, like in these images. Which is once again proof of the effectiveness of Ukrainian resilience and resistance measures against electronic warfare, since they can't have fiber optic drones in the area. But still, most of these attacks in the area are carried out with small planes, as you can see in these images. So at the same time, the Ukrainians will also directly target the logistical routes, and not just the trucks that travel on them. A large proportion of the bridges on secondary routes have been destroyed, with increasingly heavy Ukrainian bombardments using heavy drones, missiles, or glide bombs that strike farther and farther, since the Ukrainian Air Force can strike and get closer and closer to the front. The Russians are attempting to restore supply routes by ship, but Ukrainians often destroy cargo ships in the Black Sea and Sea of Azov. What about the last route to supply the southern front? Well, obviously it was to go through Crimea, except that the famous Crimean Bridge can't operate at full capacity because it has been damaged several times. And as a result, there will be restrictions on the heaviest vehicles that can't cross. There are also restrictions on trucks carrying fuel, which could catch fire if they were hit or if they exploded once they were on the bridge. And then every vehicle that has to cross is searched for hours and hours, which causes a significant slowdown in the flow. And here, for example, you can see the line to cross the bridge to leave Crimea. And then regarding the railway line on the Crimean Bridge, the traffic for its part is said to have dropped from several hundred crossings per day to only a few dozen, especially after the Ukrainian underwater drone attack in June 2025, which reportedly weakened the bridge's structure. And to top it off, the railway meant to supply occupied southern Ukraine will be destroyed by Ukrainians. Meanwhile, the special train loaded with equipment to repair the tracks was also destroyed as it was arriving in the area. In short, as you can see, the Ukrainian objective is really to completely cut off Crimea. They attacked bridges and keep destroying the replacement pontoons. They then attack the vehicles that cross these pontoons to make it as difficult as possible to repair them. Bringing in vehicles heavy enough to remove these trucks is making it increasingly difficult for the Russians to continue their efforts in the area, to the point that they had to abandon certain areas I mentioned to you, like the Kinsborn Peninsula, where they were being fired upon by the Ukrainians who were on the other side of a river without being able to respond. And in the Kherson area, the Russians are still striking, but the Ukrainians clearly say that the amount of Russian fire has decreased, especially when it comes to artillery, which is the most expensive in terms of logistics. And the Russians have even imposed fuel rations on civilians and businesses, even reducing bus services due to a lack of fuel, with the goal of saving fuel for the army. And what's the consequence of all these Ukrainian efforts on Russian logistics? Well, it's simply that Russia no longer has the means to really support its front. And it's in this area that the Ukrainians have managed to liberate up to 400 kilometers of territory since the beginning of the year, freeing 400 square kilometers in the Dnipro region and another 80 kilometers in the Zaporizhzhia region. The chief of staff of the Ukrainian army announced they liberated 600 square kilometers in the area. But according to the open source evidence we have, it's 480 square kilometers since the beginning of the year. Let's be clear. The Russians keep trying, continuing offensives instead of just defending. We've even seen mechanized assaults in the area, but it's clearly the area where they are struggling the most, and further south in occupied Crimea. There, Ukraine almost has free rein there, with strikes on all the infrastructures used by the Russian army. Roads are cut off and there's a total fuel shortage. The Russian population settled there since 2014, now trying to flee. And let's also point out that the Bayraktar TB2 drones are still carrying out their patrol missions in the Black Sea, where they are destroying Russian boats, with a Russian fleet now more confined than ever to the port, trying to stay sheltered. If we look now at the Eastern Front, in the Donetsk area, which is clearly Russia's main effort, since their strategic objective is to finish conquering Donetsk so they can say they've taken all of the Donbas. Given the territorial continuity between Russia and this front, it's much harder for Ukrainians to destroy logistics since there are always secondary roads. Even though Ukrainians are clearly targeting logistics and Russian storage sites in the area as much as possible, well, the front continues to be supplied, so Russia keeps up its pressure. For example, in the Pokrovsk area, where the assaults continue, with soldiers who are sent in very small groups, but who are met by FPVs. And in this single video, for example, from May 9th, there are 122 Russians who are killed in this way. And the Ukrainians have also developed a lot of ground robots for all kinds of missions, because Ukraine wants to replace a quarter of the men holding the front line with robots. So we're really talking about tens of thousands of robots, including now ground robots, heavy kamikaze ground robots, like this device that carries 300 kilos of explosives and goes all the way into Russian shelters to kill everyone inside the building. Obviously, these are environments that aren't accessible with traditional FPVs. But in any case, and despite the losses, the Russians are still making progress through small, successive infiltrations. Because, once again, they aren't able to carry out large-scale mechanized assaults and break through this front, and so they continue to make progress, even if it's the slowest progress in more than 3 years. 3 years, especially because the Ukrainians have gained the upper hand in the field of drones since February, both in terms of volume and technical quality, and Russia's main advantage remains their glide bombs. For example, here you see a map provided by Clément Mollin. But overall, the effectiveness of these bombs is reduced with the widespread use of electronic warfare, so we see a decrease in the accuracy of these Russian glide bombs. They still fire many, and several must hit the target. However, you can see compilations of glide bombs falling in fields or trees instead of falling on Ukrainian positions or on the targeted buildings. And the craziest thing is that these are images shared by the Russians themselves. Now, on their side, the Ukrainians are also ramping up in the field of glide bombs. Until now, they were using American JDAMs and French AASM bombs, but they too are starting to move toward the mass production of their own domestic glide bombs. We can assume they'll become increasingly effective in this area over time, even though the Russians are still far ahead in quantity, with thousands of bombs being dropped every month. In any case, in the Donetsk Oblast and on the Luhansk front, the fortress cities continue to slow down the Russians, just like Chasiv Yar, which was the city right after Bakhmut, or Yampil, where I went in the summer of 2024, or even Kupiansk, which has already been liberated twice. People have predicted the fall of these cities for over 2 years, and here you see the ruins of Chasiv Yar as an example. To clarify, these cities could fall in a month or a year, and once they fall, the Russians advance a little faster. For example, if we look at the Pokrovsk front, the city fell last February, and yet the Russians have only advanced 4 kilometers beyond that. So you shouldn't imagine that there's a collapse where it opens the door and suddenly everything will come rushing through behind. The front is solid, the front has incredibly effective defenses behind it. Here you can see some images. The next city threatened in the Donetsk region? I would say it's Konstantinivka, which is turning into a gray zone, and like all the other Russian captures since 2023, they will simply conquer a pile of ruins emptied of its inhabitants, at a human cost that will be exorbitant. But you really shouldn't be impressed by Russian announcements, Russian storytelling, their narrative, claiming that they are advancing, because every day they announce the capture of an unimportant village, sometimes even a completely secondary one. Sometimes they even announce and invent victories that don't exist. For example, they announced the capture of a city in the Kharkiv Oblast, but analysis of the images proved that these images you're seeing actually show something else, a city that's more than 8 kilometers from the front and had already been captured several years ago. So you really have to distance yourself from what Russia is saying. They lie every day. They're advancing at the slowest pace in over 3 years, just a few square kilometers per month. It's really very, very limited. But obviously they keep moving forward. And they're going to use every city and village they're taking to make announcements. They've pushed the narrative that victory is near and we should stop supporting Ukrainians since the war began, but it's becoming less effective. So, to conclude on the Russian strategic objective of taking the whole Donbas, you should know that from 2022 to the end of 2025, Russia has conquered 12,908 square kilometers in the Donetsk Oblast. But this pace is gradually slowing down, and knowing that in the first 6 months of the year, the Russians advanced by less than 500 square kilometers, in the most optimistic estimates for them, knowing that there are still 4,000 square kilometers of the Donetsk Oblast, that are still free, including the main cities, like Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. We know very well that it will still take years and years of effort, and that, in any case, structurally their speed is slowing down and they are facing defenses that are increasingly stronger. So they simply can't wait for years at this pace to be able to achieve their only strategic objective, which was to conquer the Donbas. So today we simply have to wait for the Russians to open their eyes to their own incapacity, especially since there is another area that is structural, that is fundamental. After the strikes on logistics, it's long-range warfare, in which the Ukrainians have had the advantage since February. So overall, the Russians fire between 5,000 and 8,000 long-range drones each month, with a noticeable drop in volume in June, while Ukrainian production continues to increase. With 9,000 confirmed launches in May and 11,000 in June, that's now 350 long-range launches per day with real swarm attacks, as you can see in these images. And these numbers are actually consistent with Russian estimates, since they themselves announced having intercepted 9,000 Ukrainian long-range drones in May. And roughly speaking, Ukraine has been launching more than Russia since February, so now we'll have to see if the Russian decrease is structural, for example, if they carried out work at a factory and production ramps up faster, or if it's only temporary, such as when supply factories are destroyed. Or that since they can no longer obtain Western technologies through the indirect means they used until now, for example, by going through the United Arab Emirates, who were not very happy to see that some of the spare parts they helped Russia acquire to bypass sanctions ended up in Iranian drones that the Emirates themselves had suffered on their own territory. And so there are certain ways to bypass sanctions that have been closed off for the Russians. This obviously makes supply more difficult because it has to be said, even today, in the Kh-Kazakhstan missiles, which are fired by Russia and were produced in 2026, there are still more than 200 components of Western origin, which are, well, because there is Turkey, the Emirates, and Kazakhstan that help Russia bypass the sanctions. So the fewer countries there are that turn a blind eye to sanction circumvention, the more difficulties Russia will have producing, and I think we're reaching a turning point now. And so there is a fourfold advantage for the Ukrainians in this long-distance war. First, with the volumes, I just mentioned it, they are firing more than the Russians. Then the Ukrainians have a lower cost per hit. The Russians lack interceptors as effective as those developed by the Ukrainians. In fact, no one in the world has a system as effective as theirs. That's why we suffered losses in the Middle East, because the Americans and their allies in the Gulf were not able to intercept the Iranian Shaheds. Ukrainians helped these countries defend themselves, similar to how Gulf countries were unprepared against Iranian Shaheds. Well, the Russians don't know how to defend themselves against the long-range Ukrainian drones either. And then, let's also add that we're now discovering that some Russian air defense missiles are simply unable to tell the difference between a fire on the ground and a drone flying in the air. So, for example, that's a big explosion in Moscow. It was actually a Russian air defense missile that hit horizontally that struck this silo to make it explode. And that's when you understand the importance of having man-pads that combine infrared sensors and ultraviolet sensors, with digital signal processing that allows you to see whether it's a moving target, like a missile, a helicopter, or a drone, rather than having dumb systems like the Russian way that just detect heat, go toward the heat, and in the end, can't defend themselves. When there are already fires around them, you can't really complain about it. Is that also what explains the difference with the new generation American Stingers or French Mistral, which let you systematically hit the target? And their systems, incidentally, are highly faulty, including the famous S-400. The images you see here, that's an S-400. So the most expensive and supposedly most effective system of the Russian army, which tries to intercept the incoming weapons directed at it and fails. Or the Panzer systems, which aren't able to stop Ukrainian drones even though they're positioned all around Moscow. Here you can see the map of the locations that surround the city of Moscow like this. And despite these three levels of protection, more and more Ukrainian drones are still getting through, even reaching the heart of Moscow. And then the third advantage for the Ukrainians in this long-range war is the ever-growing range of systems they have at their disposal. First, they have long-range drones and missiles that can be produced in large quantities, since they don't rely on critical components, as is the case for Russian systems, or for us, simply because they use much simpler, much lighter systems. This is modern warfare, as I described to you in the video when I visited the factories of the company Firepoint, which produces those famous FP-1 drones and also the Flamingo cruise missile. But in addition, you have the new systems that are coming in. American cruise missiles that are launched directly by aircraft. New drones that can reach up to 3,500 kilometers in range. And, of course, the arrival of the FP-9 ballistic missiles, which can carry several hundred kilos over more than 800 kilometers, and that reach 5,000 kilometers per hour. Given how difficult it already is for the Russians to intercept small drones, I really think it's going to be very complicated for them with the ballistic missiles. And another important point as well is to see how effective the Ukrainians have been in targeting all the Russian production facilities for cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and drones. For example, here it's the Voronezh semiconductor factory that was destroyed on June 22. Here is another example, with two Flamingos that will successively strike the Volgograd arms factory. And as for the Flamingo, people made fun of its size, saying it was big and would be easy to intercept. We can see how accurately it hits the target, or here again against this ballistic missile factory. And it should be remembered that these large missiles, whether cruise missiles or ballistic missiles, are essential for striking certain Russian infrastructures. Because when you have radars, aircraft, things that are light and out in the open, you can use drones, especially on refineries, But on the other hand, to hit hardened buildings, you need cruise missiles. And that's why this complementarity between the different delivery systems is perfectly suitable. When you need to destroy bridges or hit unprotected infrastructure, you need heavier weapons. And there, the Ukrainians have their own ecosystem, which is huge, much more efficient, once again, because even the Ukrainians had historic companies like Antonov and so on. Well, these are small companies, much more modern, that are able to supply this quantity much more efficiently, and the Russians have stuck to traditional methods, a bit like us, with productions that haven't yet scaled up. Even though they're clearly producing much more than we are, they haven't scaled up. They haven't gone through the industrial revolutions like the Ukrainians have managed to do over the past 4 years. Next, there's the fourth element of Ukrainian superiority in the field of long-distance warfare. It's simply the types of targets. The Russians have gigantic cathedral-like factories, known to everyone, with satellite photos that make them visible, and so when one of them finally goes down, the supply will stop. While the Ukrainians, forced by circumstances since 2022, they have developed their ultra-resilient defense industry with dozens of tiny, microscopic factories, each of them completely independent, not relying on each other. And even if the Russians manage to hit one or two of them, which is the case, for example, with General Sherry drones, one of whose factories was hit, well, 90% of the production continued completely normally, whereas for the Russians, when their fiber optic factory was destroyed, that was it. It was over. So from then on, they relied entirely on the Chinese, and the Chinese tripled their prices. Please refer to this map to see the various sites that were hit in Russia, with a French-speaking account that is specifically dedicated to proven, successful Ukrainian strikes deep inside Russia. So when it comes to Ukrainian air defense against Russian attacks, the Ukrainian defense is very effective. Certainly today the best in the world. They intercept 90% of Shahed drones and cruise missiles by using various methods, like hitting Shahed drones with small interceptor drones. I've discussed this for a long time. There, for example, you can see an interception from the outside, and now you also have interceptions being done with drones that are 100% autonomous using artificial intelligence. Then on the cruise missile side, obviously, they destroy them with cannons, with fighter jets, or with manpads or laser-guided rockets, which allow them to destroy them at a lower cost. And even if we consider that 90% interceptions is very good, it still means that when 6,000 Russian drones are launched, if 10% get through, well, that's still 600, which are going to hit their targets, so the Ukrainians are very good, but it's still not enough. And their real difficulty is obviously against hypersonic missiles like Kinzhal, Zircon, and so on, or with ballistic missiles that come in very, very fast and at very, very high altitude. For these two vector types, the Russians get through easily. So, of course, there are some nodes that are protected. Here you can see an interception by a Patriot missile against a Russian ballistic missile. So when we provide the necessary equipment, the Ukrainians are able to protect themselves, but we are not providing them with enough to intercept all these threats, whereas technologically we would be able to do it and inflict major damage. Since the Russians have the bad idea to stop targeting military infrastructure, to focus more on ideological targets, churches, sites of power that have no military value. And the fact that the Kyiv water treatment plants are dysfunctional hasn't changed the situation on the battlefield, on the front. So it's really a terrorist war against the Ukrainian population. So now let's take a step back and have a strategic overview. Today the general tone is very positive about Ukraine, but we shouldn't get carried away. Yes, we're in a very positive momentum, but above all, we're seeing the result of all these efforts. And it's the combination of these three elements that I mentioned on the channel, and we can now see them coming together and producing operational results. Because I repeat, the war will not be won on the battlefield. The Russians will never conquer the Donbas, and the Ukrainians will never be able to liberate their territory on a large scale. I don't see the Russian army collapsing. It's struggling and facing difficulties. But even when 400 km2 are liberated, it hardly changes the situation. The breakthroughs at Trest remain very limited. I hope the Ukrainians will liberate their territory, but I don't see how they could free the entire south. If the Russians dig in instead of sending more assault waves, it becomes much harder. The Ukrainians won't be able to retake territory either, even though today they still have a maneuvering force that could allow for a strategic surprise in certain areas. But overall, we shouldn't imagine that they could completely liberate, for example, the south, or totally cut off the logistical routes to the south. I think that's out of reach for now. So the Ukrainians, they have 4 strategic objectives. First, it's to make sure that Russia is no longer able to advance on the ground, and that's where we are now. Next, that the Russian defense industry is no longer able to provide the necessary equipment to its army, and that's starting to be the case in a number of sectors. Next, the Russian economy can no longer support the war effort, and here we have to be clear, if Donald Trump hadn't attacked Iran and if the price of oil hadn't doubled, Russia wouldn't have gotten this breath of fresh air. And we would have reached a point much sooner where, economically, Russia was no longer able to hold on. And the fourth element is morale, the morale of the population. Russian public opinion now recognizes difficulties, faces constraints, and is experiencing fuel shortages nationwide. And it inevitably realizes that there's no point in carrying on like this, enduring all of this and taking so many losses without even being able to make any progress. When Russia is not making progress on Ukrainian territory, is suffering losses, and its economy is collapsing, with heavy critical infrastructure being destroyed every day, the infrastructure of gas terminals, oil terminals, refineries, and large factories. People have to realize it at some point. The goal is to force Putin to open his eyes. Either he negotiates and makes peace now, or he waits, and it will be even worse, and he will be in an even worse position to sit at the negotiating table. So it's a race against time. The Ukrainians need to get a ceasefire, a peace agreement before next winter, to avoid a fifth winter of cold and suffering. And that's why today they're accelerating on all fronts, and the collapse of logistics, as we're seeing now, will accelerate. In the south, the strikes deep into enemy territory, the Ukrainian-style sanctions will continue to accelerate. And that's something I've seen in all the indicators and in videos that are coming out. I've promised you before, and officials in charge of long-range strikes confirmed to me there are more and more of them. They're really gaining expertise in this field. So all the elements are in place today for us to finally achieve a ceasefire and peace in Ukraine. Knowing that Donald Trump is now on the side of the Ukrainians, that's still a big change compared to what we saw a few months ago. And he himself says that the Ukrainians need to be able to strike more to force Russia back to the negotiating table. Today, everyone agrees except Putin, who still needs convincing, and we know this is the final stretch. I also want to thank you for showing up in such large numbers and for your donations. You know that everything you've done today continues to help provide and buy equipment. In particular, the Rubijay Brigade receives a Baba Yaga every month. Thanks to you and Team Berlioz's fundraising, dozens of vehicles have been purchased, personal protective gear for fighters, thermal systems, electrical systems, and on the civilian side to save lives. There is also now the 13th StaffNet, the medical container that was delivered thanks to your donations. This was done with the Association Act Together for Ukraine. We have vehicles, ambulances, some of which I personally delivered. So your donations continue to reach people on the ground and save lives. There you go. I hope you like this video. Next quarter, I hope we can say we're closer to peace. See you in September or October. See you very soon.